Perfect. Okay, so we're going to run a panel discussion now for about the next 40 minutes or so. We're going to talk about kind of architecture within the context of agility. Maybe, has everybody talked today? Yes. Yeah. So do we? So we know the panel. So we've got Daniel, Simon, Trisha, Alberto, and Sandro on the end there. So I do have some questions. However, these things run much better if the questions come from the audience, particularly as you've kind of absorbed all this context today. So if you do have a question, then just place your hand up. We've got a couple of people with microphones, and we will try and get to everybody before the end if we possibly can. Let's start then. So we talk about agility. When we talk about agility, we talk about feedback, right? It's one of the common components of agility, one of the most important components of agility. How do we gather feedback on our architecture?
I can have a stab at that one first off. So I've talked about this in my book, shameless plug, straight away. But get it in first. Christmas is coming. Apologies, but no, it's in top of my mind. So I was using Arch Unit quite a bit. So and there's various frameworks out there where you can actually sort of analyze or have metrics, some kind of deterministic metrics, quantitative, I suppose, is the best word, that can at least guide you on your journey. Because quality is quite an arbitrary thing sometimes with architecture, but using things like Arch Unit frameworks, you can actually make sure that you're keeping your architecture agile in your definition. So there is tooling out there, totally worth checking out. There's lots of blog posts out there, a quick Google for these kind of things. But I think for me, baking some things into your delivery pipeline that give you metrics that allow an analysis of the trends is really important. Because you may start in a bad place, but you don't want to get worse. You want to get better. Yeah. So I think that's a key thing I'd say.
Anyone else, Simon?
I guess that's talking about the internal, like code quality and code structure and maintaining integrity and all that good stuff, which is super important. But you've got the external facing stuff as well. So, looking for, and again, I mentioned this in my talk and it's in my book.
Anyone else? Anyone else got a book coming? Anyone else got a book coming out for Christmas?
But identification of risks and really just doing concrete experiments, prototyping, proof of concepts, just to prove out some of your hypotheses. So writing code.
Writing code. And how do we know that the code that's perhaps been written by us and other people matches the architecture that's been agreed to start with? I've come across this myself often.
Well, I've got a counter question. Does that matter? How much does that matter?
I think does it not matter if you are then evolving that architecture later and actually what you've got, you're not basing it off reality, you're basing it off the original design rather than actually what's there.
I think it depends on why the code is the way it is. Like if it's that way because it passes a bunch of tests and there aren't any tests that check that it matches the architecture, then that's the thing that you were talking about earlier about what you measure for is what you get. So if the code is diverging from the architecture, then yeah, we need to figure out why that might be.
And, sorry, go on, Sandro.
Do I have my mic? Yeah.
Oh, you do.
Okay. No, it's just I just would like to go back to the feedback thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was having this discussion in a podcast a while back about legacy code, but which is related to architecture in a way and design. One way to get feedback is also is there anything that we want to achieve as a business that we are not able to achieve? For example, we are not deploying often enough. We are not being able to test enough, or there's bugs slipping through production. People are not being able to work in parallel. So those are all things that you are not able to do, or you would like to do better, that your architecture could be enabling, or they are preventing you to achieve. So that is one way also to think about feedback on architecture.
Okay. So something you talked about earlier was kind of how we involve, how we get a better conversation between the kind of business and the technical side of things. And you talked about the various different stages of architecture. But one thing you mentioned was around we need to provide value, right? As technologists, we need to provide value to the business. We need to provide some value, but in that meeting. So it seems it's quite easy to imagine that when you look at things like UX and product design, that kind of thing. It's quite easy to imagine how you can provide value in there. How can we do that from an architecture point of view?
I think that is in similar lines of what I was saying before. We when we are creating a software product, you have some certain expectations, right? So, and expectations is not only related to the people consuming your services, not only like making more money or selling more of these, but also like how we're going to keep that sustainable and stuff like that, or secure, or how we're going to maintain that in production. So there are many other aspects to a software product that we expect to have. And I think that when you're talking about architecture with the business, we should address those problems, right? So it's like, how often would you like to deploy? How would you like to monitor this in production? So how would you like to test that? So all of those things are adding value to the product. They're not necessarily about the feature, it's adding value to the whole process, to maintaining the evolution of the product. And that's, I think, that one way to address the value of architecture in the business.
There are some features as well, like that architecture will give you like performance, for example. Now, performance people get a bit worked up about because they think they need high performance, but there are certainly places in London specifically where high performance is absolutely mandatory. And so, you say, measuring that performance, making sure you meet your performance criteria, that's the value that you bring. So when I worked at LMAX, having high performance financial trading systems, it wasn't about the user experience, it wasn't about the UI, it was about how fast can you complete this trade. And the architecture is absolutely what enabled that.
I want to shout back to something I saw Alberto you talk about as well, that the Accelerator Book by Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, Gene Kim, mandatory reading. We've seen it mentioned several times today, but something you said, Sandro, reminded me of this, of like the 4 correlated metrics. It's lead time, frequency of delivery, mean time to recovery, and change fail things. And those are all, like in my mind, highly correlated with architecture. If I've got a very low cohesion, high coupled system, like the lead time is tricky because I need to Trisha's point, I need to understand the code, I need to understand the system and unpick the system. If I've got a very highly coupled service-based system, I can't deploy independently, so my deploy frequency goes down. So I was super happy to see you mention Accelerate, because I think it's like a straight-up awesome book. But for me, a lot of it, though it's not an architecture book, still I got a lot of value out of it from that perspective. Architecture enables, what are you saying, Trisha? A lot of that stuff, which I thought was great.
For me, maybe there's a little glue between the first question and the second one. So there's, you're actually usually measuring what you think is correlated to architecture, like speed and lead time and so on. But there's stuff which is not immediately correlated, which is which might be the turnover. People are actually quitting this place because legacy code sucks and we cannot change it. And there are some other places where we have a little bit more autonomy, freedom to change stuff. But I've never seen a single organization making the link between the software architecture and the problem in recruiting, while I think I see a very clear red line between the two things. And since these two things are not correlated, we're probably not measuring it. And I would say that probably the missing ingredient is proximity. Like you have to be around. You have to listen to your developers cursing when they are forced to do 3-step operation that could be done in only one. You have to get the vibe of the team or the opposite of it. If you're in an ivory tower, your architecture is going to be bypassed or a cage or...
My first instinct to answer the first question was ask the developers, like, how painful is it to work with the architecture? But it's a difficult metric because, like, what is painful and what is just like, oh, I want to learn the new trendy stuff versus it is actually painful.
Cool. So do we see architecture as a completely separate role? Is it, or is it perhaps something that should be kind of the responsibility of the team, or is it traditionally we think of the architect, right? Or do we still think that, or is it something that can be a kind of shared team responsibility?
It's got to be you.
I was kind of hesitating because I just want to. Yeah. I don't want to plug my book, and I don't want to force my views on everybody. But you're right. I think historically we've seen the architect as like a separate character, often in the ivory tower, just throwing stuff down, often to be ignored by the team, as you said. Still see that occasionally, but never mind. I think the whole Agile thing prompted, with self-organization and cross-functional teams, the Agile thing prompted a lot of teams to think, well, let's not have this outside character telling us what to do. Let's kind of collectively do this ourselves. And in many organizations, they kind of shared out the architecture role amongst everyone on the team. The problem with having everybody responsible for everything is often nobody's responsible for anything. So I think collectively as a team, there's a role to be done there, and it's the team's collective responsibility. In reality, my kind of gut feel says it works better with a small number of people taking it on. Maybe not one, and maybe not everybody, but somewhere in between.
I would like to add a few things, because I totally agree. There is a great sentiment to say, no, let's federate everything to the teams, right? Because that seems the right thing to do, and we put ourselves in the role of a developer. We want to be empowered, we want to have autonomy, and all the autonomy, master, and purpose, all that kind of good stuff. But we've seen in a few of our clients exactly that. So they just federated everything to the teams, and it was just a mess, right? So I remember one of our clients, they said to us, like, we don't even know what we have anymore, right? So we just have a bunch of stuff. And we tried, is Mesh, where's Mesh? Mesh is there. So you can talk to us later on, because you can give a lot of concrete cases, but we tried many different approaches with our clients. We tried a technical committee, having representatives of all the teams getting together and stuff. Problem we had loads of different problems. I don't want to go into so much detail because I would take the whole time here. But there are pressures. Different teams have pressures. They have different preferences and stuff. It's a committee, but who owns it? Who actually makes the final decision when they don't agree? We had technical authorities. We had component guardians. We tried so many different ways. We don't have enough a concrete answer, because it varies from company to company. But one thing I need to emphasize is great to want to be empowered and want to do things, but do we even have the skills to do that? And I think that this is another problem. We haven't exercised the architecture skills enough in the past 10 years, and a lot of teams are being empowered to do so, and they just don't have the right skills. It's not the same as writing code.
I agree. And so when I first started, there was a lot of things like UML and things like that. And now the architecture we see is boxes and lines, perhaps the odd sequence diagram, right? And I know Simon's working hard to try and change that. But so who here in the audience has ever would be happy to write some UML? Yeah, but
that's more than I asked this morning. What's going on?
They changed their minds.
Yeah.
It's working.
and who in the audience works in a team where the team is responsible for the architecture?
About 10, 20%?
Yeah, okay. So is there a kind of disconnect between, because clearly most people are working with kind of centralized architecture function. We think that's probably wise in most cases, not necessarily in all cases. Is there some work to be done to kind of bring the architects closer into the team to gather that faster feedback, rather than the ivory tower thing is the thing that we've come across in the past, and we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater and went to no architecture. But is there things that we can do to bring the kind of architecture function closer to our teams?
So there is a book I'd recommend. It's not entirely
is it
related.
Yours, son?
No, it's called Elastic Leadership by Roy Osherove. And although Roy is talking about the team lead role, I think all of the same stuff applies for the architecture role, because it's essentially technical team leadership. Mm-hmm. And it's a context-specific, context-dependent approach to leadership. So if you have a junior or chaotic team, telling them what to do works best, because they don't have the experience to solve their own problems. If you have a team of really great people, don't tell them what to do because they know, just get out of their way. But even with the chaotic team, you want to give them some time and experience to fail and learn, so you're making them more mature. So that kind of helps answer the how do we do the architecture role on a team. It's a bit more complicated, because a bunch of the organizations I've been to this year, they either have layers of architects, so you'll have like one or more architects on a team, so they are responsible for technical leadership of a product that they're building. And then you'll often have one or more layers of architects sitting on top of them. Sometimes these are called centralized architects, or sometimes they're called enterprise architects. And some of those are just doing the kind of policy dictation, which we heard today is not necessarily a good thing. Some of them are looking for ways to save money and be more efficient across the whole organization. Some are looking kind of longer term future. So, as a business in 5 years, we're going that way, so we should start orienting our teams to go that way. It then gets more complicated, because I see a lot of organizations now doing the Spotify thing. So they have a bunch of code bases, and they give any team complete autonomy to change anything in any code base. Mm-hmm. So now you're having feature-based teams who are delivering features and services and stuff. So now these feature-based teams are often changing code across multiple repositories, multiple systems, multiple services. And then you get into an interesting question about, well, how do you maintain the integrity of those shared code bases? Because now you've got nobody looking after them. So then you need a matrix of different people looking after different parts of the organization, and it's like super complicated.
Yeah, super agile.
No. Structured.
So I've been talking a lot. Do we have any questions in the audience at all? Yeah, we got one here. Who's got the microphones?
They're racing.
So this is probably a question to the whole panel. I would like to ask you about your experience when you just understood that achieving a feasible architecture will require change in how you think or how people are thinking about it, how you reason about it. And there was probably a moment when you might not have all the power and resources to change everything in one day or in 1 month. What was your experience at that time? How did you approach that quest? And obviously, I think that few of you right now working as a consultants. I wonder if it's really possible to change a company from inside, if you are not on the leadership or management position. Thank you.
I have some experience in that field. In that, I remember when I was first reading about Agile, I was working full-time for the banks and various other and big enterprise manufacturing organizations. And I remember thinking, like, unless, as an everyday jobbing programmer, unless someone in higher management buys into making these sorts of bigger changes, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to push those changes because I'm just me doing my own thing. As I became a bit more experienced, I realized that, of course, the answer is it depends. There are organizations where you do your best to try and, I've just published a link to an article about influencing upwards. So you do your best to influence upwards, to find out like who are the influencers, how to kind of like figure out what their pain points are and suggest that maybe the changes you want to see are the ones that will fix their pain points. There are some organizations where you can see that you will be able to affect some of these changes and you keep going. There are other organizations where you will see that you're not getting anywhere and you have to conserve your energy for some of those things because you have to accept reality. So some places you can make those changes and some places you can't. I do believe that as a consultant, once you get on site, you've already been called in to make some changes and the organization already knows they want to do something. So generally speaking, consultants do have a bit more power. As a permanent employee in an organization where you have ideas on how things could be better, you don't always have that. You need to find the influencers, influence them, and try and push things in the direction, or at least have the conversations about, are my ideas going to fix someone else's pain?
I would like to add a few things as well. So I totally agree with Trisha about being able to influence, because we were not born consultants, right? So most of us, I believe that we went through the normal path of being a permanent employee in companies and stuff. But even as a permanent employee, you develop the skills to navigate the organization, to figure out who you need to speak to. And also, as soon as you start failing in driving that change, it's very easy for us also to say that other people cannot understand what we say, instead of trying to introspect and say, like, why am I failing to push that idea across? And as soon as you start doing that, you start developing the consultancy skills, regardless if you are a consultant working for a consultancy company or not, because the ability to consult is not really related for you being a consultant working for a consultancy company, right? You can still develop that as a permanent employee, and I believe that quite a few of us did that in our time. It's not going to be easy, but if you are able to sometimes change your message and provide the value of the solution, instead of going with a solution. Another thing that is very quickly I would like to address is, very often we go with a solution and we don't invest time in agreeing on the problem. We found, and that's very consultancy skills that we discussed. Before we even propose a solution, we have a quick discussion, and we try the waters. How is it? What's this expression? Test the waters to say, do we even agree on the problem first? So if you are able to align the people in the meeting or the people that you want to convince, if you are able to at least make sure that we agree on the problem, it makes it much easier for us to start discussing how we can solve it. So this is all consultancy skills that you can do as a permanent employee.
I'd also, sorry, sir.
Go for it.
I'd also chuck in the mix. I genuinely love reading. There's a great book. I think it's Douglas Cotter. The surname is definitely Cotter. It's called Leading Change. And there's 12 or 8 steps, actually, I think, in the original. That talks about building a coalition, creating a sense of urgency. And me as a consultant, I learned the hard way, kind of, Sandro, like you mentioned. But there's a few books I've read in my time where when I read it, I'm like, oh, I'm half doing that. And just by reading someone else's very clear steps, I adapted a little bit of my techniques. And for me, after reading Cotter's book about sort of leading this change, I really had to level up my communication skills, my collaboration skills. And there's a whole bunch Critical Conversations, Crucial Conversations, sorry, it's another fantastic book. There was a lot of really good models, which me as a kind of engineer, my mindset, I could almost learn these models and try them out on folks as I was trying to influence them, trying to connect them. And that, regardless of my technical skill set, this model of leading change combining with learning new communication and collaboration skills helped me a bunch. So if you like reading, that would be a path it worked for me, to be fair, but as in a path I'd recommend at least trying.
So I would add switch to the same problem. The model is really, really simple, maybe simplistic in some places, but it's not about convincing people. It's about giving them a punch in the face so that they cannot ignore the problem. And a lot of the stuff that I do with even storming is just making sure that the problem is 15 meters long, colorful, with a lot of arrows pointing to the thing. So you cannot really get out of a workshop ignoring this, and that's exactly part of the strategy. And then actually some people ignore it for many, many reasons, and okay, then yeah, goodbye. Yeah.
I was also going to mention the Switch book, which is Chip and Dan Heath.
Yes.
So it's about giving people an emotional reason to change. So it's likewise with my diagramming workshop, people draw these horrible diagrams. Once you get the groups to switch diagrams, they realize that they've made the same mistake the other group have, and now they're kind of emotionally bought into, okay, we need to fix this. 2 other things I was going to throw out there. It's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to get permission. So as a consultant, just go do stuff and don't tell people, and then show them the results and the outcomes afterwards. And we shouldn't forget something else here. And there's another saying, I don't know if I can get this right, but a prophet is often not respected in their hometown. So a lot of the time I go in and do short-term consulting and training with an organization, I'm parroting exactly the same stuff the team is saying internally, but because it's coming from me, an outsider, there's a bit more incentive for people to listen. Unfortunate, but way of the world.
They call that fly-in consulting in the US. If you have to fly someone in the US internally, you instantly respect that person more, which is nuts, isn't it? But so many times I saw that.
I guess one thing also is if you're having to do this through the power of influence rather than having any kind of authority, that at least if you have a single person or a small group of people that are responsible for architecture, at least you know who you have to influence. If that's just spread across where do you start?
One thing I'd add, I don't know if anyone else sees this, consultancy. I used to work for a consultancy company, Open Credo, in London, and the interesting thing we found, and I don't think I'm speaking off term here, is we used to get brought in by folks in the middle of organizations, but the actual pain points were above. So I think Trisha mentioned this, managing upwards.
Yeah.
I learned that skill the hard way. Often you got brought in, you're on borrowed authority already, because you're borrowing someone's authority, and then you recognize that they're the problem sometimes, yeah? These people, they know there's a problem, they're not sure where it is. Uh-oh, it's them, but, creating blockers. That's really awkward as a consultant, yeah? So I learned this kind of managing upwards, and that was a really valuable skill. Recognize that someone who brings you in can be your worst enemy, and that's what they've brought you in to control you, effectively. So there's a whole bunch of patterns, and sometimes if you can't change the situation, you have to change the situation and leave, yeah, I would say.
Great. Another question over here. And then we've got one on the left over here, our left.
This question is for Trisha. First of all, thank you for the evaluate feature of IntelliJ. I would literally be dead without it. So
I'm personally responsible for that.
So my question is, do you think there is still value in commenting code? Because people like to say, oh, my code is self-documenting, but then when you look at like a 10-line nested Lambda, you're like, is it really self-documenting? So what do you think? Is there still value in 2019 in commenting your code?
Well, okay, you know what the answer is, don't you? The answer is it depends. Throughout most of my professional career, I was like a massive commenter. I would like comment my code to pieces because my memory's appallingly bad, and I would just write comments everywhere because I wouldn't remember why I did something. Then when I started working at LMAX, and I was working with people like Martin Thompson and Dave Farley, and they were sort of like teaching me, I can have the code explain what it's doing and why it's doing it, then I bought into the LMAX philosophy of 0 comments. I would say right now I'm like somewhere, I would prefer no comments, but I think comments definitely have value. But your comments, so actually I forgot to point it out in one of the example codes I actually had. The class is called default query implementation or something, and the Java.comment was a default implementation of query. Like, that is not a comment, that is ridiculous. But if the comment is like, I know this doesn't really make any sense, but we have to do it because blah, blah, customer had this problem, see ticket number 5, right? That is a valuable comment. It's still, the problem with comments, as you know, they get out of line with the code itself. So as soon as someone fixes that workflow, that comment becomes invalid. So comments, they need love, and I feel like if they are going to be in the code base, they need to document the why, not the what. I can see the what, it's a list. You don't need to tell me it's a list. So you document the why, and then every time you are in that area of code, you need to somehow reevaluate whether that comment is still valid. And if you don't know, delete it. Because if you don't know if that comment is valid, then it's not giving you anything other than confusion, and it's better off not being there.
Great, thank you.
I have something to add to this one, because we are thinking about comments, about something to document stuff, and one of my most valuable comments in code was I started rambling for something like half a page about antibiotics on chicken food, and the fact that you can actually cure yourself about the flu by just eating 2 or 3 rations of chicken breast. And what's the purpose of it was later in the project, like my boss was looking at me, are you dumb or what? But the thing was, later in the project, I had new teammates, and they were saying, oh, wow, look at this. Oh, an entire page talking about antibiotics in chicken food. Oh, you are on that class. Let's have that conversation. So it was a fantastic trap for colleagues. Every time somebody was commenting this, well, okay, now we got to talk. This class is complicated. Let's have this conversation.
So as a placeholder for a conversation?
Yes, yes.
And we had another question. Who's got the mic at the moment? We got someone got a mic there? Okay. We'll come to you next.
So the last question, you talked about comments going out of date and needing love. But earlier in this panel, we were talking about architecture diagrams getting out of sync with the system, and the response was slightly different, which was, does it really matter? So does it matter that any documentation gets out of date, and if so, what should we do about it?
If it's confusing, it's not helpful. So if it's out of date, it's usually going to be misleading. So if it's going to cause you more time to do the thing you need to do, then that's a problem, I think. But the reason why I said does it matter is because a lot of people don't read documentation. So sometimes if the wiki is out of date and no one's reading it, then the amount of time taken to update the wiki is potentially a waste of time because no one's reading it anyway.
So I have a tool that can help. So one of the problems with architecture diagrams getting out of sync with code is because this is the same thing I spoke about here last year. So you've got this model code gap. We have a top-down view of our architecture, and we have a bottom-up view, and they don't match. And one of the things we need to do better is figure out how these structures in our code, how they relate to our architectural construct. Once we can figure that out, it's relatively straightforward on some code bases to auto-generate things like component diagrams automatically. So some tooling can help there. Also look at this book called Living Documentation by Cyril Martre. And this is all about embedding useful snippets of documentation in the code base and having your documentation generated automatically. So again, there are some tooling options that can help there.
I'll check in the mix. I think something you mentioned earlier, Simon. I personally find the macro comments more useful than the micro ones. Because like, to your point, Trish, like the thing worse than no comments at all are comments that send me down a rabbit hole, which is completely out of date and irrelevant. But I do like, so when I'm trying to find a place on the street, I like a high-level map that gives me the right direction. So I love Mike Nygaard's architecture decision records. I think you mentioned them, Simon. They're awesome. And for me, like that stuff is hard. It doesn't go out of date quite so often. So do you know what I mean? Like the comments in the code, particularly in a high churn situation, it's very easy to get some drift. But I think you mentioned, Trish, like the why is often really important. Like I want to understand like why the person who wrote the code did, or even if it was me, I want to remember why, what's the motivation for doing this kind of thing. And I find the macro there is more important than the micro. So I don't mind the shifts going at different paces, because I think the change rate and the value is different. That makes sense.
I think that there was a question here.
Yeah, I think we have one.
There's one there, one here, and
He's
then
had
one
his hand
there.
up for a while.
And one at the very back.
Mm-hmm. Just there. If you just put your hand up, there we are.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hi. So I work with a code base that is subject to the Spotify effect, as you described it. And so reading the code and self-documenting code is like daily life. How would you recommend, or would you recommend anything for dev like me dealing with it, and how to manage it in a wider team? Because the code base basically does change almost on a daily basis across services, because different teams implement different features. And even, for example, if I wrote a particular service 2 weeks down the road, I'm not even sure what it does until I go and read it from beginning to end, basically.
So Simon, I think you mentioned that you'd come across this fairly recently.
Yeah, you just have to do something like start writing small amounts of documentation, start cleaning up small bits of your code base, start commenting small bits of code base. Don't stop the line and try and fix lots of stuff at once. Business as usual, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, you just have to start somewhere. Draw some high-level diagrams, get a feel for what's going on, make sure you understand the responsibilities, and just go from there. Really, there's no magic answer, I'm afraid.
Getting metrics is also key. I know I bang on at metrics a lot, and that's the way I kind of work. But I found a few times just sort of getting, again, it's all about the trends for me. A lot of times on projects I've worked at, it's about just going in the right direction. And often you rock up and you've got no sort of quantitative idea of things. But if you start looking at cyclomatic complexity and all these couplings and all these kind of things, you at least get some baseline, so you can have a discussion to go, look, this is sort of objectively the quality of where we're at. There's an awesome gent, does a lot around not only sort of combining, say, cyclomatic complexity and other quality metrics, but Adam Thornhill's work, also combining churn in the version control. So you can actually match up complexity in code and the churn in the repos. And Adam's got a couple of great books. Your Code is a Crime Scene is a fantastic book, and there's a couple other books he's written as well. And combining that complexity and how the code is changing was a real eye-opener for me of just modeling kind of like, this is, you run some simulations or some tests or some metrics or whatever, this is where we're at, and there's a whole gamut of things he recommends, and then at least gives you a baseline to, if we're going to make some changes, whether you're getting better or worse. So I find that, again, context is massively dependent here, but I found that really useful just to understand the systems, understand the directions, understand our progress. Because if we do want to make change, and sort of the architecture goes hand in hand with the comments and things as well.
Or you might also switch the metrics in the emotion space. Like one of the things that actually worked really well in one scenario was we started collecting all the components on a wall. Like the rule was every time you touch the components, if it's not visible on this map, you have to put it on. And then red dot for every bug to cover, green for every evolution, and yellow for every little change that we had. After a couple of weeks, the team had, okay, now we don't have so many components, we have 42, strange number. And the red dots were all concentrated in 2 of them. And And the team was already decided, okay, now we have to do this, because before that it was, oh, I see horrible code. I see horrible code too. We are all victims of the same sad fate. And no, you can improve the situation a lot if you touch it there. Code is not going to get beautiful suddenly anywhere, but in this place, you can make a difference, at least for somebody. And you need to perceive this. Today is better than yesterday. It's not a fantastic day, but it's better than yesterday. So, and that is giving you the effort to, let's make another little change.
One of the other techniques I've seen to sort of at least get some visibility over things like churn, and you're talking about churn and changes, and this is going to be an unpopular idea, I think, is using code reviews. Now, I don't mean gateway code reviews. I don't mean nothing, because the whole point about working this way is to be able to effect change as quickly as possible. I don't mean like nothing goes in until someone reviews it. I mean literally like you've already committed the change, but 2 or 3 people at least should take a look at it. Or if you are interested in what's going on, like the code is changing too rapidly, you need to spend a bit of time like reviewing the code changes so you can at least get some visibility over the changes that are coming in. And as you say, like where are they coming in? Are they coming in at the same sorts of places? Incidentally, JetBrains does have a code review tool. But also, it does some of those metrics. It does look at things like this class gets touched all the time. Like, you know, this class is the oldest class. It's a God class. It gets touched all the time. Or like for every, you know, these commits, lots of stuff happened in these commits. These are the clumps of changes. And so those sorts of tools are really helpful for that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Something that we talked about in one of the breaks, Trish, was around the power of pair programming and mobbing as well. The similar kind of thing is, if you, like to Alberto's point, if you've spotted a tricky area, don't just try and fix it yourself. Get some other folks in. Because it's like we were just saying, Trish raised the point that often we all have little bits of context, and only when we get together do we actually have the complete context. So I've definitely, a lot of Woody's Will stuff, I've learned much from Woody over the years, but sort of mobbing, swarming is probably a more friendly term, swarming a problem, I find as a great way, be that problem lack of documentation, wrong documentation, bad architecture, swarming, establishing a shared context is a really good way to rapidly learn as a team. Management do push back sometimes, go, oh, like 10 people on one problem, but we all know software's like, it's not how fast you type, yeah, it's the mental models. So I try and work with folks to convince them this is time well spent.
There is just a quick one. When we have a very complex environment with loads of services, again, those are just ideas that we are trying out, and they are context dependent. They will not work everywhere. The more I see cross-functional teams touching everywhere in the code or all the services, the more mess I'm seeing. I'm not seeing a great system being built where everyone contributes everywhere. But at the same time, going back to a place where each group of people are self-contained or boxed into a small area is not great either. So we were discussing a few models in between. And this is related to the component guardians that we had at UBS. We tried to a certain degree, but it's the role. I think where we failed, not failed, but what was not so successful was the component guardians. They were responsible for one area of the system, and that could be a group of services, for example. But they were the guardians. They would decide what is done in there. And instead of have I think one module that we'd like to, a model that we would like to try is there is one person or a small group of people that they know that area well. They are the guardians, but that doesn't mean that they are the ultimate authority. What they do is they help the teams. So as the teams are working cross-functional features and they need to touch the payment side of the system, there is a group of people that understand payments inside out. It's not about understanding the code. It's understanding all the subtleties in that domain with being PCI compliant, is regulations and all the things that are related to that domain that's not easy to understand. And that small group of people could help the teams to build the features in that area according to the knowledge. So they could join the teams. So they are fixing their domains, but they help the teams as the teams needs to move. I think that this kind of hybrid model might work better in the future.
It's similar to Trisha's answer before, right? Is that those people understand the why? That's what you really need to know, right?
So one of the things I've seen some of these organizations do is they do have these kind of guardians. That's a great term, by the way. And if you are making a major change to one of those services, you send a request for comment. So you're like, here's my understanding of what you have. This is how I think I want to change it. Invite comments, what do you think? Although that sounds great in theory, you either get no responses because everybody is like super busy, or you just get like swamped with responses because you are changing the one thing that everybody knows about. So again, it's one of those things you might want to think about trying.
So we had a couple more questions. So who's got the microphone at the moment?
Person right at the back's been had
There was a few questions. There was one here. There was Michael there.
There we are. Okay, let's go for the back of the room there.
Hi, thanks all for your talks today. I'm just wondering, like, we were talking about tool sets and things to visualize stuff. I really like visualizing stuff. It helps us to make a mental model of the things, like event storming and stuff. Thank you for that. But maybe it's a question or an idea for Simon Brown, like you're building a tool set upon a language. Maybe any opinions, like against or in favor for making it part of our languages? Like, I don't know, should we, move on and make higher level abstractions of just keeping it to classes and make like real components, or I don't know, higher level components and make it a part of our language that really gets used by more people, or I don't know, like not leaving it optional, like a bunch of stuff that we're doing nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of comes back to my talk from last year called the model code gap. So it's the top-down view versus the bottom-up view. So for those of you who are Java developers here, you might think about, well, we build layered applications in Java. So you have a bunch of things in layers. The problem with Java is there's no layer keyword. So this begs the question, well, how do we do layering? And the answer is, well, there's not one answer. Some people use jar files, some people use Maven modules or Gradle modules or packages or namespaces in C#. So we take all of the basic constructs we have, like classes, interfaces, enums, and so on, and we bundle them together in some way to form those architectural abstractions. So you're right. Why don't we have languages where these architectural abstractions are first-class things? So you can do like public component X or public layer Y. Why not?
Well, I think that Java moved in that direction ever so slightly by introducing modules. Ever so slightly. But it was not really it's not a great example, is it?
It's not super used, is it? Yeah.
But it was useful for the JDK itself because it forced them to think in terms of making a modular system and what does the architecture look like. And so introducing that abstraction, like from the one up above packages, helped them with architecting their own system.
Yeah. There is a move. So I write for InfoQ, so shameless plug for InfoQ. We've just put out a programming languages trend report. And we interviewed a bunch of folks, looked at lots of surveys, programming languages. And there is an interesting trend. There's something called Darklang, which is kind of in private beta, which is floating around. Ballerina, kind of same. And they are trying to pull up these abstractions. So I played around with Ballerina a little bit from the WSO2 crew. It's a Marmite, as we say, framework. Some hate it, some love it, but it sort of bakes in the notion of some of the Kubernetes primitives into the language. So you have you define the kind of pod or the container. And some people love it because it helps them, the mental model is so much clearer. I'm building a container, maybe like just one horrible class, we'd all probably look at it and go, whoa, like you need to modularize that. But for some folks, building replaceable, short-lived microservices, that's perfect for them. So I think we are seeing, in my brief foray in that space, it's not really my expertise area, but we are seeing these languages that kind of, particularly recognizing the impact of things like cloud and containers. So I definitely recommend having a look at Darklang and Ballerina and a few other languages. People are sort of recognizing it, but I don't know if it's ever going to be perfect.
Yeah, mostly at the moment, teams tend to be either bootstrapping off things like Java annotations and frameworks. So if you're using Spring, you can like at component, at controller, and then you can go figure where those things are, or just naming conventions. But yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity there.
The Ballerina stuff pretty much is annotations now, so they've kind of co-opted it in some way. So
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm afraid it's got to be the last question. I think there's someone down the front here who's had their hand up for a while. I'm really sorry if you missed out. I guess most of you guys are kind of going to hang around for some beers and pizza afterwards. So if you do have specific questions, I'm sure they'll have a chat with you downstairs, perhaps. So let's go.
Yeah, I have a question. It will maybe cost me a bit to define, because the question is a bit tricky. Following this idea about the servant lead, okay, I want to help the team. I don't have authority, but I'm the kind of a de facto leader because I can serve them, guide them. It is. Do you think that this figure is working in every single team? sometimes you see teams that are more mature, others that are less. Maybe you are finding it's not a team, just a bunch of professionals working together with different. We're talking about permanent people. Maybe you have a mixture of consultants, people working offshore. You cannot get drunk with these people. So this fun that when you are drunk with people. Well, it's just an example. Do we need to study not just techniques, but a second degree on psychology to do our job on I'm not talking about just consultant. Maybe we are not consultant, but pursue others. But on the other side, the company is paying for a solution, and he likes your school. Your school is the direction that you are taking. And he want the company maybe want you to impress this in your company. What is the you know what I mean? You have the company is asking to you to change things, but you cannot use your authority. Mm-hmm. You need to persuade. But sometimes, are you persuading? If we have a 0 to 100, the degree of matureness of a team, are you always using the same, or are you being more dictatorship on the next mature and more servant on the other side? Set the boundaries, maybe.
Okay.
So in my background as a consultant, the company that we used to work for was very good at sending us on technical training, but they were also super good at doing soft skills training, weren't they? So they used to send us on leadership courses and influencing courses, and that's a huge part of it, because you are, as a consultant going in, you have no authority. You're not someone's line manager, you're not their boss, you're not giving them their salary reviews, their appraisals, but you have to somehow influence and lead the team. So the soft skills, I think, is a huge, important part of that.
I think this is true across the board. Like every time I end up giving like a career advice talk, whether it's like a leadership one or a junior one, I just keep saying, yeah, okay, so you do need to know the technical stuff, but really the soft skills stuff is just so important. You're just not going to get what you want if you don't understand how to communicate, how to influence, how to listen. And you were saying something a bit earlier on about your communication skills being really absolutely key. And with the different types of teams, you have to be able to change your style as well. Like you say, the different types of people that you talk to, different types of teams, you learning to recognize what sort of team you're in, what sort of role you're in within that team, who are the influencers or not, like what you can and can't do. That's a very difficult bit. Learning like which architecture to implement is nowhere near as difficult as all of that stuff.
Definitely. So I'm afraid we're out of time, but perhaps just one last one from me is becoming increasingly obvious, I think, to everybody here that the soft skills are so much more important. This ability to influence and persuade, and so just but it's also probably the most difficult thing to learn, right? So, any books you've read or any materials that perhaps people can look at in their own time? Books you've written, perhaps?
I'll check out Pat Kuar is a really good person to follow, ex-thought worker at N26 now, Challenger Bank. Pat, I did a podcast with Pat actually a few weeks ago, so you can search for that. I learn stacks. I just ask simple questions, listen to Pat. He's got a book, Talking with Tech Leads, fantastic book. I'd also recommend, I've forgotten the gent's surname, but the book is Elegant Puzzle. And actually Camille Fournier's Manager's Path book is probably really good as well. Those are ones I've learned from.
There is one also called Driving Technical Change, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author.
Got that one, Sandro. Yeah, I can't remember the name either, but I've got it.
So, yeah.
It's on Pragmatic, isn't it, I think?
Yeah.
Pragmatic Press.
So Driving Technical Change is a good book.
Visual meetings for me, like whatever is putting the truth in the face of the people, then decision becomes obvious. Even more if it's somebody else's idea, even if it's your plan, even better.
Yeah.
For me, like recommended reading, I mentioned it in my talk actually, like Badass, Making Users Awesome. It's kind of influencing and stuff, but in a different point of view, because it's all about like when you're trying to, if you want to make your product amazing, you shouldn't be teaching people how to use your product. You should be teaching them how to be good at what they do. And this is true within business. Like if you want to achieve something inside your business, if you want to achieve something for yourself, you have to figure out, like I said, like who has a similar pain, what problems are you fixing with that, and fix other people's problems. Like how do you get people to be awesome at what they do?
Great. Yeah. I think the Driving Technical Change on Terence Ryan?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Did you?
Yes, just to pick up on Alberto's point, game storming, innovation games, again, more stuff in that kind of theme. Lots of talks online by Linda Rising.
Mm-hmm.
She talks about psychology and agile mindset and some fascinating stuff there. When you go to a conference, don't go to the tech stuff. That's the other piece of advice. Learn the stuff that's hard.
Yeah. The technical stuff is easy to learn online. The softer stuff is much better in person at conferences, I think.
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to be here next year.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all your questions, and a round of applause for the panel.